So in part 2, we are going to be asked to find just the domain and the range. So they will give us different scenarios, different types of relations in different formats. Here we've got, do you remember what this one's called? A mapping diagram. A mapping diagram doesn't tell you which one's x and y. You know it by looking at the arrow. So it starts at the x value, starts at the domain, and goes to the range. Here we have a table, and typically we have x and y, but this time they don't. They have c and d. Remember, x and y are the typical axes, and typical name for axes, but not necessarily all the time. And here we have c. C is just a graph, and they have just a few different points, and then D and E we have different scenario. We have a graph, but we've got a line, or here we have a curve, and we want to represent all the different domain and range values. So let's take a look at the first one. So we're trying to find the domain, so we just write down domain, and you tell which numbers represent the domain. Remember, the domain are the x values, the first coordinate in this set of ordered pairs, and here we have these values right here being the first component. So this represents the domain. And so we go ahead and list those numbers. So here we have 6, and we have 5, we have 2, and we have 1, and that's it. Those are all the domain values. Well, next we got to find the range. And so the range represents the second component. So I guess we'll first have to write down, and that's what we're looking for here, the range. And again, the range represents the second component, so we just go ahead and write those numbers down. Here are the second components. And I know it's the second component because the arrow goes to it. It starts here and goes to the second number. And so we call those our range values. And so here we have -4, -3, and 0. Those are the different range values. If a number repeated, we wouldn't have to write it twice. And actually, a number does repeat. Could you figure out which range value repeats? Well, it's right here, -3. See how 5 goes to -3 and 2 goes to -3. So we just have to write it the one time. Now let's take a look at the next one. Here we have another set of domain and range values. So all you're going to do in your homework is write down domain, write down range, and then just list the numbers. And so let's take a look at the domains. Remember, domain represents the first number. And so the first number, well, in this case, it's these numbers right here. So these are our first numbers. We write down 3, we write down 5, and -4. Well, then we move on to the range. And the range represents the second set of numbers. And so the second set of numbers, well, that'd be just the D values. Typically they're going to go in alphabetical order, but not always. It all depends on what the x values represent. But just remember, it's the first number. So if we have a table, the ones on the left represent the first numbers, ones on the right represent the second numbers. And you just list them. And we can just list 2, 1, and 8. And those are our range values. I've got 3 more here. Let's take a look at the next one. It's a graph. And the graph just has a bunch of ordered pairs. So the best thing to do is to list what those ordered pairs are. And so let's go ahead and do that. This one here, we start from the origin, 2 spaces to the left, 1 space down. So you always go x first, then y. And so since I went in the negative x direction, I'm going to write -2, and then I went down 1, so I'm going to write -1. That is that point. Take a look at this next one here. This one is 1 over and 1 up. So that is just 1, 1. And this next one is 2 spaces to the right and 3 spaces up. So that's 2, 3. And the last one here is 1, 2, 3 spaces. So again, you're counting spaces. Never count the origin as 1. It's the spaces. So 1 space, 2 spaces, 3 spaces, and then down 1. So that's 3, comma, -1. So we're just going to list the domains and the ranges, just like we did on the mapping diagram and also the table. And so on your homework tonight, just write down domain and range, and then we'll list them. So we'll start with those domain values. And looking at the first number in these ordered pairs, this number, this number, this number, and this number right here, those are the first numbers. If any repeated, we wouldn't have to write it more than one time. And so none of these repeat, so we just write them all down. -2, we have 1, we have 2, and we have 3. Those are all of the domain values. Now looking at the range values, again, that's the second number in the ordered pair. So as I look at it, I've got -1, I've got 1, I've got 3, and I've got -1. So I just list those numbers. -1, 1, I've got 3, and I've got -1. Oh, that number repeated. I don't need to write it down more than one time. If you wrote it down twice, it doesn't hurt anything. It doesn't mean it's wrong. It just is extra work that you had to do. You had to use that pen stroke to do that. So I'm going to erase this little extra comma since that wasn't needed. And now we can move on to the next one. So our next one's a little different. This time, instead of points, we've got a line, but we do have 2 endpoints. So just as we did on this last problem, we labeled the ordered pairs, I want you to do the same thing with this one. So label this ordered pair. It goes 2 spaces to the left, 3 spaces up. -2, comma, 3. That's going to be important because when we're dealing with a line or a curve, there are so many points that make up this line. And they're so close together, that's why we see it as a line. We can't even count how many spaces make up that short little line. It's an infinite number of numbers, an infinite number of points. So we're going to end up having to use inequalities to represent that. Well, let's figure out this point here. It's 2 spaces over, no spaces up, so we call that 2, 0. So to show the domain, we are going to use an AND statement. When we solve those absolute value inequalities or compound inequalities, we're going to do the same thing. So let's take a look at this one. For the domain runs from the smallest number is -2. So we'll put -2 here. The largest number, though, is +2. So again, I'm looking at these numbers right here. I'm looking at the x component right here is -2. The y, or the other x component at the other point is +2. So I'm looking at those numbers, and I'm starting at -2, and I'm going all the way to +2. Now, domains are x values, so I'm going to put an x in the middle, and I'm going to show that the values of x, the domain values, run from -2 to 2. So the values of x need to be bigger than -2. They can't equal -2 because I have the open circle. So that's why there's no line underneath this. But there is a line underneath the next one. The values of x can be no bigger than 2, but they can be 2. So x is less than or equal to -2. So the values of x run from this point down here, -2 to +2. So when we think about it, if we were to graph them, the points, they just run in this direction. From this point here, but it's an open circle at this point, so from -2 to +2. Well, let's take a look at the range values. Range values, those are running from 3 to 0. So what we can do to start with is write down our range. So let me change that color back to black here. Right over here. Range. The range runs from 3 to 0. So I'm going to start at the lower number, 0, and go to the bigger number, 3. And range values are y's, not x's, so I'm putting y in the center. Now it's the same sort of thing. You see, it goes from 0 to 3, but it's an open circle on the 3, closed circle on the 0. So the value of 0 is one of the solutions. So I'm going to say that y is greater than or equal to 0, because again it starts here and it's going up to 3. And so the value is no bigger than 3 though, or it is not 3 at all. So y has to be less than 3. So again, the values are running from this 0 here, closed circle there, and then they go all the way up to the 3, but it's an open circle on the 3. So the values of the range run up and down, the values of the domain run left and right. And we see that on this next one. Now, again, this next one, the values of the range, they start right here, and they go all the way down to this point here. And so if we look at this point here, we go ahead and label, write down what the number that is. This is 2 spaces to the left and 2 spaces up. And so when we do this one, we label that negative 2, comma 2. And then this point here is 2 spaces over, 2 spaces up. So that one is 2, comma 2, positive 2 this time. Now we want to also know where it ends. It ends right here. So this point here is 0 spaces over, but 2 spaces down. So the ones we're looking at, the ones we're concerned with for the range values, are from 2 down to negative 2. And so when we list the range values, we're going to go ahead and start at that lower number. So we'll write down range here. The lower number is negative 2, so we'll start there. And we're going all the way up to positive 2. Now the range values are not x's. What are they? They're y's. That's right. So y needs to be greater than or equal to negative 2. It could be equal to because it does end down here. It doesn't have an open circle. But the values of y need to be less than or equal to positive 2. So those are the range values. Let's take a look at those domains real quick. Domains, again, those are the x values. They run along the x-axis. And looking at the smallest number here is negative 2. The largest number is positive 2. We don't even concern ourselves with the stuff in the middle. It's just from this point to this point that we're concerning ourselves with. So there are all these numbers in between that run in between here along this black curve. And so those values, again, run from negative 2 to positive 2, and we don't put a y in here, we put in x. That's right, the values of x have to be greater than or equal to the smaller number of negative 2, but less than or equal to positive 2. So that's the difference. When we have a curve, that's when you're going to use the inequality signs. When you have just points, a mapping diagram, or when you have a table, that's when you're going to use just listing some points. So that's the homework for tonight.